Picture this. It's 1945. The most destructive war in history has just finally ended. But, for the average person standing there in the rubble of Europe, the celebration, it was incredibly short-lived. They were living in what was starkly described at the time as a graveyard of broken nations. Just to kind of give you an idea of the sheer scale of the destruction here, in some cities there were literally millions of cubic meters of debris that had to be cleared away entirely by hand. Infrastructure was just gone. Factories were reduced to ash, and people were literally starving in the streets. So amidst all this absolute devastation, the geopolitical map was actively fracturing into occupation zones. These broken nations were desperately trying to figure out their future. And honestly, more importantly, they were trying to figure out which of the two emerging superpowers was going to end up shaping it. Were they going to align with the capitalist West or the communist East? The tension was just palpable. You could feel that a brand new Cold War was already starting to take shape right there in the ruins. Well, looking across the ocean at this devastated continent, the United States came to a dangerous but highly accurate realization: poverty is absolutely the best recruiter for a revolution. The logic here is pretty simple, right? If starving people can't find bread under a capitalist system, they're inevitably going to start looking for it in a communist utopia.
So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we aren't just looking at some dry historical charity fund. We're going to explore how a giant pile of American cash, we're talking over $13 billion at the time, which is roughly, over $150 billion today, was deliberately transformed into one of the most successful macroeconomic tools in history, the Marshall Plan. This wasn't just aid. It was a carefully engineered reconstruction of an entire economic system, fundamentally designed to build the modern West.
Okay, so here's the blueprint for how we're going to reverse engineer this machine today. 1. The Cold War calculus. 2. Economic transplant. 3. Systemic shield. 4. Regional integration. And 5. The staggering results. Let's dive in.
Section 1. The Cold War calculus. To truly wrap our heads around this plan, we first have to examine the geopolitical stakes. There was this deep, pervasive fear in Washington that a South Korean-style division could easily happen right across the heart of Europe. They were terrified that, without intervention, people might genuinely view a Soviet-style command economy as the better alternative. So winning this ideological Cold War, it required a whole lot more than just building tanks and deploying soldiers. It required undeniable wealth to defeat the appeal of command economies. This became the absolute core mantra driving U.S. policy. The West must be prosperous. Economic strength literally had to become the ultimate geopolitical deterrent.
Moving on to Section 2, economic transplant. So the Marshall Plan was far from just a simple handout. It actually operated in 3 distinct, highly strategic phases to jumpstart Europe. And it all kicked off with Step 1, a massive, unprecedented transplant of industrial capacity. The U.S. realized pretty quickly that simply sending food was just a short-term band-aid. Food keeps people alive today, for sure, but it doesn't build a self-sustaining future. To prevent the kind of economic stagnation they'd seen in colonial-era economies, the strategy totally pivoted to long-term innovation. They started sending massive amounts of raw materials, tractors, and heavy machinery to physically jumpstart European factories with the latest tech. And, we usually picture all this aid going straight to places like Germany, right? Well, actually, scratch that. The UK actually received the largest share of this money to revitalize its massive industrial base. Which brings us to Section 3, systemic shield. What makes this phase so incredibly fascinating is how the aid money was deliberately weaponized. It wasn't just about rebuilding anymore. It was about creating a massive, undeniable propaganda victory for the West. From the strategic perspective of the U.S., the goal was to frame the rapid recovery of the West directly against the Soviet Union's economy. The message they wanted to broadcast was totally binary. Capitalism equals modern conveniences, refrigerators, cars, a good life, while communism equated to a command economy of long queues and strict rationing. Next up, Section 4, regional integration. This final stage was perhaps the most ambitious of the whole shebang. It forced fractured, historically hostile nations to stop acting like bitter rivals and actually start acting like a globally interconnected team. And doing this required a level of ruthless pragmatism. The US essentially forced countries like France and the UK to accept a wealthy, powerful, and rebuilt Germany. Imagine being the French so soon after the war and being told, hey, you need to link your vital coal and steel markets with your historic rival. No way, right? That is an incredibly bitter pill to swallow. But the geopolitical calculus won out. A rebuilt Germany was an absolutely essential buffer against the Soviet heartland. A weak, starving Germany simply wouldn't hold the line. So this interconnected trade network forced economic teamwork across borders. And this specific template of regional integration, it laid the literal structural groundwork for the early European Union that we all know today. It's a real game changer. And finally, Section 5, the staggering results. So after all of this careful engineering and strategic integration, what was the actual impact? Well, the impact was almost immediate. Western Europe experienced economic growth rates that essentially doubled what they had been before the war. A literal 2x multiplier. It was an absolute explosion of wealth and productivity, very closely echoing the famous miracle on the Han River that South Korea would later experience under similar principles. Tracing this timeline really puts the whole transformation into perspective. In just a few short years, the region went from the 1945 graveyard of broken nations to a 1948 industrial jumpstart fueled by the Marshall Plan. This engineered a highly integrated, super prosperous Western Bloc. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fence, the Eastern Bloc relied on a much less efficient client-state system, one that ultimately collapsed under its own weight by 1991. If there is one core takeaway from this entire explainer, it's this. In the modern world, a highly functioning, engineered economy can be the ultimate geopolitical deterrent. Economic strength genuinely beats a million soldiers. The Marshall Plan successfully transformed a completely war-torn region into a deeply integrated, stable network of trade. But as we wrap things up today, I want to leave you with a provocative question to analyze the true legacy of the Marshall Plan. Looking at all this evidence, was this a selfless act of charity to save a broken continent? Or was it simply a highly clever, incredibly successful way for the United States to buy a league of loyal allies? Definitely something to think about as you continue to study modern history. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.